It begins with a sound. Not the call of an owl or the rustle of leaves, but a muffled, desperate cry, so faint it barely rises above the drone of cicadas. The year is 1824, deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the hills hold secrets older than memory. A single cabin squats at the edge of the tree line, its roof sagging, its windows boarded. From the outside, it looks abandoned, another forgotten ruin in a land full of them. But if you were close enough, if you pressed your ear against the warped wood, you'd hear something no one should ever hear. Children sobbing, chains scraping against a floor, a hymn being whispered, broken and trembling, as if sung under command. Inside, the air is heavy with smoke and rot. The stench of iron, sweat, and something sweetly spoiled clings to the rafters. The walls bear strange carvings, symbols etched in frantic repetition, half erased by time. No one from the nearby town dares approach. They say the place belongs to the Harrow family. At dawn, a neighbor swears he saw movement, a figure dragging something into the woods. By dusk, the forest swallowed the trail whole. No sheriff came. No preacher spoke. In this county, silence was survival. The cabin door remained locked, the cries fading until only the wind carried them. And so it was written, though never in the ledgers of the state, nor in the records of the church. The Harrows had begun their work, and their name would become a shadow no one dared speak aloud. This is not a ghost story. It is a history buried in the dirt of the mountains, and tonight you will hear it. The Appalachians have always been a land of isolation. In the early 1800s, the mountain ridges cut counties off from one another like walls of stone. Roads washed out every spring, rail lines never reached this far, and the only law most people knew was the word of their preacher, or the silence of their neighbor. The county where the Harrows lived was one of those places erased from official maps, left blank as if the government itself wanted to forget it existed. Farmers scraped the soil for corn, coal miners dug deep shafts, and children carried burdens heavier than their small bodies could bear. Poverty wasn't just a condition. Here, it was a chain, wrapped so tight around the community that no one expected escape. This isolation bred a kind of quiet obedience. When a child went missing, it was explained away. A bear attack, a river current, a runaway. When 3 children vanished in 1 year, people whispered but looked down at their boots when questions rose. A preacher in the county seat once said, from his pulpit, "Do not ask the mountains what they hide, for they will answer with madness." It was in this climate of silence that the Harrow family thrived. Their farm stretched far beyond what a single household should manage, yet no. One asked how they came by so much land. They built their fences high, their windows shuttered, and their church attendance impeccable. The family name became a kind of talisman, spoken with respect but always a little too softly, as if the syllables themselves might draw attention. The state ignored the county. The county ignored the Harrows. And in that fertile ground of neglect, cruelty took root like a disease with no cure. By the 1820s, America's cities were swelling with poorhouses and orphanages, places where unwanted children were stacked like cordwood, waiting for whatever fate society assigned them. Some were adopted into families, others were sold into labor, and some, those who vanished from the records entirely, were sent to the hills. The Harrows were masters of this quiet commerce. To outsiders, they appeared charitable, taking in orphans when no one else would. Their wagons would arrive at smoldering orphanages after a fire, or at county jails after a mother was hanged. They carried papers signed by local officials, legal, transfers of custody stamped with seals that no one dared question. But once those children disappeared into the Harrow property, they ceased to exist. No census recorded them. No church baptized them. No graveyard ever bore their names. Whispers spread that the Harrows had struck a bargain with city authorities. take the unwanted children off their hands, and in return receive payment in both land and influence. It was a perfect system of erasure. The state could wash its hands clean, the churches could claim charity had been done, and the Harrows could build an empire on silence. Some travelers passing through the mountains swore they saw children walking in lines through the fields, barefoot and pale, their heads shaven, their eyes dull. Others described hearing laughter, carried on the wind, laughter that twisted midair into screams. But when locals were asked, they shrugged. Children play, children wander. The Harrows are good Christians. No one kept count of how many vanished into those hills. But by 1830, the number was high enough that even the forests seemed to carry it, holding the memory in their roots. And still, the wagons kept arriving. The Harrow family did not arrive. In the Appalachians as ordinary settlers. Local lore claimed they came from the east, Virginia, maybe farther, bringing with them money, livestock, and a reputation for severity. By the time they set foot in the forgotten county, they already carried an aura of power, as though they had chosen the mountains not out of need, but out of purpose. At the head of the family stood Elias Harrow, a tall, skeletal man with eyes so pale they looked almost colorless. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of Scripture. Elias claimed that God had chosen his bloodline to purify the weak, and the church welcomed his tithes without question. His wife, Miriam, was no less formidable. A woman of iron posture, her face carved with lines of judgment, her voice sharp enough to cut. Together, they built not only a household but a dominion. Their children were raised to obey without hesitation. Neighbors recalled how the Harrow boys never played with others, how their daughters never laughed. They moved in groups, always watching, always silent, as though the very act of joy was forbidden. In church, they sat rigid, their hymns sung. In perfect unison, their eyes fixed on the preacher as if daring him to falter. Behind the fences of their farm, however, darker tales circulated. The Harrows were said to keep their own graveyard, its stones unmarked. Travelers spoke of hearing chanting at night, long after midnight bells, and when a child disappeared, suspicion turned naturally toward the family. Yet nothing was ever proven. The Harrows had money, they had land, they had the church's blessing, and most dangerously of all, they had silence as their greatest weapon. The year 1827 marked the first time people began whispering openly. It started in spring, when 3 children from the county poorhouse were transferred to the Harrow farm, under the guise of Christian guardianship. They were last seen riding in the back of the Harrow wagon, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10, faces pressed against the slats as the wagon rumbled toward the mountains. After that, they were never spoken of again. At first, the disappearances were explained away. One official claimed the children had been relocated to relatives. Another said they'd run west with settlers. But neither explanation held. Mothers who had worked at the poorhouse swore no relatives existed, and none of the children's names appeared again in any church, school, or census ledger. They had been erased. By summer, more whispers grew. Hunters in the hills told of strange fires burning on the Harrow property, bonfires too large for simple gatherings. A trapper claimed he heard crying carried across the valley at night, followed by a single high-pitched note that silenced the forest. Others described finding scraps of clothing deep in the woods, tiny shoes, a torn sleeve, half buried in the dirt. But when accusations were raised, Elias Harrow himself appeared at the church, Bible in hand. He denounced the rumors as slander of the weak-minded. He donated more coin to the pastor. He reminded the congregation that the Harrows had fed orphans when no one else would. The matter was dropped. The cries were forgotten. Still, some say that Autumn, a boy's carved initials were found scratched into the doorframe of the Harrow cabin. 3 letters, 3 children. A silent testimony no one dared speak of aloud. In the Appalachians of the 1800s, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the heart of authority. It dictated morality, decided disputes, and carried more weight than the sheriff's badge or the judge's gavel. To question the church was to risk exile, and to stand against one of its favored families was unthinkable. The Harrows understood this better than anyone. Every Sunday, Elias and Miriam arrived with their children in immaculate dress, their wagon polished, their Bibles worn from use. They tithed more than any other family in the county, coin, grain, even labor for church construction. When a new steeple was raised, it was Harrow lumber that cut the sky. When a hymn book was needed, Elias supplied it. And so, when whispers of missing children reached the pulpit, the sermons shifted. Preachers warned against idle tongues and the sin of false witness. They preached submission, obedience, and the danger of questioning God's chosen vessels. With every sermon, the Harrows were wrapped tighter in the cloak of sanctity. Behind closed doors, however, not all were convinced. A young deacon once confessed that he heard strange chanting near the Harrow farm, voices reciting scripture in distorted tones, mingled with cries that did not sound like prayer. But when he brought this to the elder pastor, he was silenced. "Do not question those who do God's work," the elder warned. Weeks later, the deacon left the county and was never seen again. It was not merely faith that protected the Harrows. It was fear. To accuse them was to accuse the church itself, and no one dared carry that burden. The pulpit became their shield, the hymns their mask, and so, behind the veil of holiness, the family continued its work unseen. Locals gave it many names. The hush house, the black cabin, the place where sound goes to die. But most spoke of it only in whispers, a structure deep in the woods, built by the Harrows with timber so thick and seams so tightly sealed that no cry could escape its walls. Hunters claimed they stumbled upon it once, mistaking it for an abandoned trapper's lodge, but what they found was stranger. A building with no windows, its door reinforced with iron hinges, and the faintest trace of ash in the air as if fires had burned inside for years. When one man pressed his ear against the wood, he swore he heard breathing within. Days later, that hunter disappeared, his rifle found leaning against a tree as though left in surrender. The cabin became legend. Parents warned their children never to wander near the Harrow woods, for it was said that the cries of the missing were still trapped inside, looping endlessly, unheard by the outside world. Those who ventured too close reported a strange silence, as though even the birds avoided the air above its roof. Dogs refused to approach, pulling their leashes tight, whining, their hackles raised. What unsettled the county most was the way the Harrows themselves spoke of it, when they spoke of it at all. Elias called it a place of correction. Miriam referred to it as God's quiet chamber, but their children never mentioned it. If the word cabin was ever spoken in their presence, their eyes darted downward, lips pressed shut, as if silence was commanded into their very bones. And so it stood, year after year, rotting yet unbroken, a monument to everything the town refused to see. By the 1840s, the region had already seen its share of tragedy: mine collapses, sickness, floods. But the fires were different. They came suddenly, without warning, sweeping through orphanages in the nearby counties with uncanny precision. In 1842, the Claymore Home for Children burned in the night. Witnesses claimed the fire started too fast, as if the walls themselves had been soaked. Dozens of children perished, their bodies never recovered. Yet, in the weeks that followed, several survivors were seen being escorted into Harrow wagons. No official questioned where they were taken. 3 years later, the Henderson House Orphanage went up in flames. Again, no cause could be proven. Again, the Harrows arrived before the embers cooled, offering shelter and salvation for the displaced. A preacher praised their mercy, calling them God's hand in tragedy. But some noticed the odd timing. The way the harrow wagons seemed always prepared, their doors reinforced, their roots hidden deep into the mountains. By 1849, it was no longer coincidence. A third orphanage burned, this time in a different county altogether. Records vanished in the aftermath, names erased. The fires devoured not only wood and flesh, but memory itself. Locals began to whisper that the Harrows weren't merely opportunists. They were orchestrators, that perhaps the fires weren't accidents at all, but carefully lit torches, destroying the evidence of children whose lives were already promised to the family. But no investigation came. The state wrote the disasters off as negligence, poverty, bad luck. The church praised the Harrows louder, drowning out dissent. And so the cycle continued. Fire, ash, silence, and wagons filled with children who would never be seen again. The mountains had grown hungrier, and the Harrows were their chosen keepers. It was not enough for the Harrows to take children. They reshaped them, broke them down piece by piece, until obedience was not merely demanded, it was absolute. Survivors, few as they were, spoke years later in fragmented whispers of the rituals inside those shuttered walls. New arrivals were stripped of their names. Elias declared that names tied children to their former lives he called sinful and wasted. Instead, each child was given a number, carved onto a wooden token they were forced to carry at all times. To lose it was to lose the right to food. Days were spent in silence. Speaking without permission invited punishment, sometimes a day without. Bread, sometimes hours in the cabin. The children were starved, then fed small rations while hymns played, until hunger and prayer became linked in their minds. Miriam enforced a ritual she called the stillness. Hours of kneeling in darkness, hands folded, heads bowed, until legs trembled and minds drifted into delirium. Sleep was denied. Beds were removed. Children were kept awake for nights on end, then lulled into exhaustion with Elias's sermons. Long, droning recitations of Scripture twisted into commands of submission. The message was clear. Salvation belonged only to those who obeyed the Harrow will. Worst of all were the songs. Survivors claimed the Harrows forced children to sing hymns in unison, even as punishments were carried out. The voices of the broken became their own torment, each note a reminder that suffering was sanctified. And so the children did not merely disappear from the world, they disappeared from themselves. By the time the Harrows were finished, they were shells, obedient, voiceless, conditioned into silence. The mountains did not need chains to hold them. The Harrows had already built stronger ones, in the mind. Every atrocity the Harrows committed should have sparked outrage. The vanishings, the strange fires, the cries carried on the wind. These were not secrets. People knew. The town saw, heard, and felt the weight of it. And yet, they turned their faces away. Why? The answer was simple and damning: survival. The Harrows owned vast fields, and in a county where hunger was constant, their grain filled stomachs. Their lumber built barns, their coin paid debts, their labor saved churches from collapse. To speak against them was to lose the lifeline they offered. Farmers who whispered too loudly found themselves without seed the next planting season. Merchants who dared to raise suspicion discovered their supply routes mysteriously blocked. Even the sheriff, once bold enough to question Elias Harrow directly, returned from the family's property pale and trembling. Weeks later, he resigned and vanished west. And so the townspeople convinced themselves that silence was righteousness. They prayed louder, sang louder, worked harder, all while averting their eyes from the children who vanished into the Harrow wagons. They taught their own sons and daughters, don't ask, don't look, don't wander near the Harrow land, but complicity is never passive. It seeps into the bones, reshaping guilt into superstition. Locals began to believe the Harrows were not merely powerful, they were chosen, untouchable, beyond human judgment. Some whispered that God himself had given them dominion over the unwanted. Others said the family's cruelty was a curse, and to interfere would bring it upon your own bloodline. And so the town became an accomplice, not by action, but by absence, by the deliberate closing of eyes, the turning of backs. In their silence, the Harrows thrived, and in that silence more children disappeared. For decades, the Harrows operated unseen by the world beyond their county. But in 1873, an outsider arrived, a schoolteacher named Clara Whitfield. She was 26, educated in Boston, sent by Missionary Society to bring literacy to the mountain children. What she found instead was a wall of resistance. The townsfolk welcomed her politely enough, but their hospitality was thin, brittle. Mothers refused to let her teach their children past sundown. Fathers warned her never to walk the roads alone. When she asked about the Harrow family, the air seemed to grow heavier, and conversations ended abruptly. Suspicious, Clara began keeping a journal. She noted how wagons carried children into the hills, yet never out. She recorded the strange, smoldering fires on the Harrow land, fires that never seemed to spread but burned for days without explanation. She wrote of a girl she glimpsed in the fields, barefoot, thin, eyes vacant, who vanished when Clara called out to her. Her final entries were the most disturbing. She described hearing songs at night, faint hymns carried on the wind, sung in tones too perfect, too rehearsed to be natural. She also detailed a midnight visit, men in black coats standing at her door, warning her to leave questions to God. Clara tried to send her notes back east, but they never arrived. Her trunk was rifled through, her papers scattered. Then, one morning, she was gone. The townsfolk claimed she'd gone back to Boston, but her horse remained tethered. Her belongings were left behind. Only her journal, half burned, was ever found, hidden beneath the floorboards of the schoolhouse. The last legible line read, "The Harrows do not take children. They consume them." The mountains kept their secrets, but sometimes the earth itself betrayed the Harrows. Hunters, trappers, and wanderers spoke of strange markings carved into trees deep within the Harrow woods, symbols no one could name, etched with knives into living bark. Circles intersected by crosses, spirals broken by jagged lines, crude, figures with arms outstretched. Some swore the carvings bled sap thicker than usual, as if the trees themselves recoiled. By the late 1800s, stories spread of stone arrangements hidden in clearings, rocks stacked in precise triangles or arranged, in rings too symmetrical to be accidental. Beneath them, bones were found, animal bones, at least according to officials. Yet those who saw them firsthand swore some were too small, too delicate to belong to any beast. Travelers who camped too near the Harrow property reported waking to find symbols drawn in ash outside their tents, as though someone had circled them while they slept. Dogs barked furiously at the shapes, refusing to cross them. Horses reared, eyes rolling white. Most chilling were the trees marked with initials, letters carved in uneven hands as if done by children, names with no families in town, names never seen in any census. Beside some of the carvings were crude drawings, houses, stick figures, crosses. Silent cries for remembrance, swallowed by the forest. The Harrows dismissed these symbols as childish mischief, but the townspeople whispered a darker meaning, that the markings were rituals, sigils to bind silence itself, ensuring no child who entered their grasp could ever call for help. And whether superstition or truth, one fact remained. Those who stumbled too close to the symbols often disappeared soon after. The woods themselves had become an extension of the family's grip, alive with warnings no one dared to interpret. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was cataloging itself with precision. The census became not just a head count, but a ledger of lives, names, ages, occupations, households. Yet, when officials reached the Harrow property in 1900, What they recorded made little sense. The family listed over 30 children living under their roof. 30. More than any other household in the county, more than most orphanages in the artist state. Each was marked as a ward, a term left undefined. But when census takers returned 10 years later, not a single one of those children remained. No deaths recorded, no marriages, no relocations, just absence. The anomaly was noted in federal archives, a peculiar irregularity lost among thousands of other ledgers. But in the county, the silence was deafening. Farmers remembered seeing those children, thin, silent, laboring in the fields, under watchful eyes. Yet none grew into adulthood. None carried Harrow bloodlines forward. They had been accounted for on paper, then erased in life. Some suspected clerical error. Others whispered darker theories, that the census itself had been manipulated, names invented to mask numbers the Harrows could not conceal. Still others believed the children had been given over, in some ritual fashion, their identities consumed along with their bodies. What unsettled the few who studied the records was the pattern. Every 10 years, the Harrows reported dozens of children, and every 10 years those children vanished before the next count. Over decades, the numbers grew staggering. Hundreds of children existed in the ledgers, yet in the flesh none could be found. It was as if the Harrows were breeding silence itself, feeding it generation after generation, until the government's records became nothing more than gravestones no one ever carved. By the winter of 1928, rumors of a hidden chamber beneath the town's chapel had spread in whispered tones among the few surviving children of Fairhaven. At first, no one believed it. Why would a family obsessed with secrecy and control leave anything behind? But when a young surveyor, Henry Lowell, was sent to inspect the chapel's foundation after a landslide, he uncovered a hollow wall. Inside, a narrow stone passage led to a locked iron door, its hinges rusted yet still unyielding. Behind it lay what should never have been found, a library. It wasn't a library in the sense of order and learning, but rather a suffocating archive of despair. The shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound journals, each marked with dates stretching back to 1812. Many contained not sermons but meticulous accounts of punishments, experiments, and trials of the bloodline. The cruel patriarchs of the Fairmont family had recorded every twisted ritual, every child broken under their watch, as though these atrocities were part of a holy ledger. The words were written with a disturbing pride, long passages describing the strengthening of purity through pain, or how the weak were made silent for the good of God. The deeper Lowell read, the more his sanity faltered. He found diagrams of bodies marked with cuts, notes about breeding experiments between relatives, and chilling records of infants who were returned to dust when they did not meet expectations. Perhaps worst of all were the letters from church officials in nearby towns, thanking the Fairmonts for their sacrifices in the name of order. The corruption was not isolated, it was systemic. The library should have been burned. Instead, it became a curse. Those who touched the journals claimed to hear children crying when alone at night. The air grew heavier, as if knowledge itself had become a haunting. What Lowell had unearthed was not just evidence of cruelty. It was proof that the evil was deliberate, sanctioned, and written into history itself. When the first whispers of the Harrow family's practices reached the nearby town of Black Hollow, it was the church that stood at the front line of denial. The local clergy, men who claimed to be shepherds of the soul, dismissed every accusation as wild superstition, the ramblings of poor, uneducated mountain folk. From the pulpit, they condemned the rumors as heresy, branding anyone who spoke against the Harrows as a sinner blinded by fear. But beneath their righteous words lay something darker, complicity, perhaps even a bargain struck in silence. The townspeople, desperate for guidance, listened. They trusted their priests. They trusted the stained glass and the steeple. Yet in the shadows of the chapel, parishioners whispered of strange donations the church received: bushels of grain that never spoiled, livestock that grew fat when others' herds starved, and candles that burned with an unnatural light. To some, it seemed the Harrows had purchased more than forgiveness. They had purchased protection. Records show sermons growing sharper, more authoritarian, as if designed not to soothe but to intimidate. Those who questioned too loudly were called out by name before the congregation. Some were forced into public repentance. Others disappeared quietly, their absence never mentioned again. The church books were meticulously kept, yet a handful of pages, covering years most closely tied to the Harrows' rise, were ripped clean, leaving behind jagged scars in the parish ledger. It was no longer faith, it was control. A sanctuary turned into a prison of silence. To step against the Harrows was to step against the church, and by extension, against God himself. For those who doubted, the line between religion and ritual blurred until they could no longer tell which sermons were holy and which were meant to mask the cries echoing through the Appalachian pines. Beyond the hollow where the house once stood, there was an orchard, apple trees, but not like the ones that thrived elsewhere in Appalachia. These bore fruit that twisted on their stems, hard, sour, and blackened before ripening. The soil was rich with something unwholesome, as if every root fed from more than earth. Locals whispered that the orchard grew where the family buried its failures: stillborn children, broken livestock, and those who were too weak to carry the family's burden. A surveyor in 1919 documented the orchard after being hired to assess the land for possible reclamation. His journal, retrieved decades later, recorded grotesque details. Roots as thick as limbs above the soil, breaking through in knots. Several rise like skeletal hands, clutching upward. No natural order. Here, trees choke each other, branches warped into archways like shrines. He refused to eat the fruit offered by the townsfolk, who claimed that it had once been a source of cider, though none would say who drank it. But the orchard was not merely a burial site. It was a reliquary. Children wandering too close spoke of hearing whispers in the branches, voices shaped like prayers. Hunters claimed the deer avoided the grove, circling wide as though it emanated some repellent force. One boy swore he saw eyes inside the apples, watching, and when he bit into one, he vomited blood until his throat blistered. The orchard remains one of the darkest symbols tied to the family's name, for if the house represented cruelty, the orchard represented permanence. It grew from the bones of generations, carrying forth their corruption and seeding it into the land itself. Even after the family was gone, the trees lived on, bearing fruit that tasted only of ash and sorrow. By the winter of 1911, the Bledsoe house was less a home than a mausoleum for the living. The walls, thick with soot and grease, had begun to buckle inward, as though the house itself was caving under the weight of the secrets it had been forced to contain. Locals whispered that strange sounds carried from its foundation, deep, resonant groans like the breath of something trapped beneath the earth. Men who tried to investigate refused to return a second time, claiming the air around the property felt heavy, charged, like standing too close to a lightning strike. Inside, the children, what few remained, were gaunt, their skin pale as candle wax, their eyes glassy, reflecting horrors they could not name. Witnesses spoke of them singing in unison at night, a hollow chorus of voices reciting words in no known tongue. Their songs could be heard drifting into the valley, unnerving anyone unfortunate enough to pass nearby. Farmers began abandoning their land, taking their families further downriver, unwilling to endure the nightly reminder that something unnatural was taking root in the Bledsoe home. Reverend Josiah continued to preach in the parlor, but his sermons had curdled into ranting prophecy. He spoke of blood debts owed, of ancient covenants that required flesh to endure. His words were feverish, spiraling into madness, yet his flock, fewer now, yet more devoted, hung on his every syllable. The family no longer sought to hide their nature. Their corruption had metastasized into a dark kind of pride. And then came the night the house itself seemed to revolt. Beams cracked, windows shattered inward, and plaster rained from the ceilings. Those who survived claimed the structure moaned with a sound too human to be wood. Something was breaking free, and those inside were dragged further into the abyss they had so carefully constructed. The discovery of Father Michael's double life spread like fire through St. Helena. The man who preached about sin had been secretly drowning in his own. For decades he had controlled, manipulated, and silenced those who knew too much. Some whispered that his sermons weren't meant to save souls, but to hide his own guilt. The abandoned cabin outside town became the center of investigations. Blood-soaked floorboards, rusted chains, and half-burnt journals were unearthed from beneath the rotting wood. Each page revealed chilling confessions of violence masked as righteousness. It was no longer just a case of murder. It was evidence of a hidden cult-like following that Father Michael may have led. Families began, stepping forward, admitting their daughters had vanished after meeting with him. What seemed like isolated tragedies were now connected in one horrifying web. The truth was clear. The pastor's secret wasn't just about one murder. It was about years of unreported evil thriving under the guise of faith. And still, one question lingered in the town's heart. How many more secrets remained buried beneath St. Helena's holy ground? The townspeople of St. Helena no longer entered the church with bowed heads. They looked upon its stained glass windows with suspicion. What once symbolized salvation now felt like a monument to the crimes hidden inside. Every whisper, every glance on the street carried the same unspoken truth. They had trusted a monster. Authorities widened their search, uncovering tunnels beneath the church cellar. Dusty passageways, lined with candle wax and crude markings on the walls, suggested secret gatherings had taken place there. Some residents recalled faint chanting on cold nights, but dismissed it as imagination. Now, it seemed those sounds were real, echoes of rituals cloaked as prayer. The more they dug, the more they realized Father Michael hadn't acted alone. Old records hinted at helpers within the congregation, names buried under layers of secrecy. Those who had stood beside him at the altar may have been guarding more than Scripture. But fear grew alongside the revelations. If the pastor had allies, were they still among them, watching silently from the pews or sitting across the table at supper? The truth was spreading, but so was paranoia. The final days of the investigation brought a haunting silence to St. Helena. The church was locked, its doors chained shut, but locals swore they still heard the organ playing faintly at night, drifting across the town square like a hymn for the damned. Inside the tunnels, investigators found a journal, Father Michael's last confession. Its pages revealed a chilling obsession with purity, sacrifice, and salvation through suffering. He wrote not as a priest, but as a man possessed, convinced that blood was the only path to God. Yet the journal ended abruptly. No final prayer, no farewell, just one unfinished line, the chosen will. The rest was scratched out violently as if he feared someone reading it. For the townspeople, closure never came. Some left St. Helena, unable to live under the weight of its history. Others stayed, carrying the scars of betrayal. The church remained a hollow shell, rotting under the sun, avoided even by stray animals. To this day, no one knows if all of Father Michael's secrets were truly uncovered. Some believe the darkness he unleashed still lingers, buried not in the ground, but in the hearts of those who once trusted him. The pastor's secret was never just his own. It became the town's curse.